I believe that is our cue to get started this morning. So, we are going to pick up, just like every other week, right where we left off. We're going to be in Hosea 8, right at the end of the chapter. And while y'all turn there, I'm going to read verses 11 through 14, just while y'all get over there. When Ephraim multiplied his altars for sin, they became his altars for sinning. Though I were to write out for him 10,000 points of my instruction, they would be regarded as something strange. Though they offer sacrificial gifts and eat the flesh, the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their guilt and punish their sins. They will return to Egypt. Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces. Judah has also multiplied fortified cities. I will send fire on their cities, and it will consume their citadels. If you remember, we are in Hosea 8, 9, and 10. There are these chapters in the minor prophet Hosea of judgment. They solely focus on judgment through their entirety. And chapter 8 sets this, picture of, Egypt, actually. Israel's returning to Egypt. Israel's returning to the state they were in before the Exodus. Because that's what they've wanted. In their pursuit of these other idols and these other gods and these other nations, all they're really asking for is to go back to where God found them. And that's what Hosea 8's been picturing. Is they've gone back to idolatry. They've gone back to this place. They've desired Egypt yet again. And here, at the end, just truly, these handful of verses just truly show how far gone the northern kingdom is and how bad it's going to get. This destruction, this judgment is truly going to devastate them. And there's a couple interesting ideas I want to touch on. One, the first thing that set out the gate is every time they built these altars, it just led to more sin. They're using it to multiply. Right? Because here's the thing, not all these altars have to be to idols. You see it all the time. They build altars to God in places that aren't Jerusalem. But no, they're much rather building altars to sin. They're multiplying the problem. And this is interesting. Though I were to write out for him 10,000 points of my instruction, they would be regarded as something strange. God's just putting it plainly. He's like, look, I could write it out point by point by point by point by point down to the thousands, and you still wouldn't get it. You're that far gone. You won't even listen to point by point instructions. And ultimately, God's not going to accept their strange and odd sacrifices anymore. They're going to return to Egypt. They're going to go back into captivity, slaves of sin. Because that's what Egypt was. That's what Paul talks about sin being in the Romans. It's slavery. And they've asked for it, they've sought it out, and God will give them over to it. David, I think, puts it pretty well. The only acceptable sacrifice to God is that of a broken spirit, Psalm 51. And here they're not even trying to bring him that. They're just bringing him these odd sacrifices that God's not going to accept. Before we bump on to my last point here on Hosea 8, does anybody have any thoughts on this return to Egypt or Hosea 8 at all? Well, I have one last thing I want to touch on here. It's verse 14. Israel has forgotten his maker. That line. See, God is Israel's maker. He forged them. He made them. And they've turned around and forged idols. The created worshiping the created instead of the creator. See, Israel was originally intended to be God's idol or image to the nations, just as man was to be from the beginning. Genesis 1. And let us make man in our image. The mission hasn't changed from the beginning. Man, Israel, was to show the nations God, so that they would worship Yahweh. But rather they have forged their own idols and no longer worship their Maker. I mean, the sin hasn't changed. The people still have the same problem. So anything else on Hosea 8 this morning? Patrick.
Just there in 14, because most of this is against Israel, but when he talks about Judah and their strongholds, that happens under the Assyrian invasion. Even though Jerusalem isn't destroyed and Judah isn't taken into captivity, it's only by a miracle that Assyria doesn't invade or be able to get into Jerusalem, right? That's the miracle that doesn't happen. Anyway, but their strongholds were destroyed by the Assyrians. So even though this is predominantly against what Assyria is going to do to Israel and the utter destruction that those tribes are going to face, Judah is not going to just walk away scot-free and not have to worry about what God's saying.
Yeah, absolutely not. You're right. Judah's going to catch a lot of this as well. Now, yeah, are they going to face the same immediate consequences? No. But actually, they do get hit pretty hard by Assyria. That's kind of what later on allows Babylon to come in, because they are still in this state of recovery from, well, Assyria. Yeah, you're right. Judah catches a lot of this. They do have citadels and things destroyed. Anything else on Hosea 8 this morning?
Reminded in, I had to look it up. It was John 33 where they said, we're the children of Abraham and we've never been in bondage, you know. And what a thing to even say. How fickle, how they do not learn their own history. You know, as an old history buff, history's kind of sort of important. Otherwise, you keep making the same mistakes, you know. But anyway, I'm reminded of what they said there in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that the John 33, or was that chapter 3?
It was chapter 8:33.
8:33. I think you're touching on something here that plays, well, one, Hosea heavily, right? It's chock full of allusions to their history. And, well, so are all the minor prophets. So is pretty much anything from Genesis up through Revelation. It's chock full of these, well, allusions to what's happened before. Even explicit quotations of what's happened before, references. Because I think it rings very true. Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that's Hosea's big point here. God brought you out of Egypt through the Exodus, and you're turning back. Slaves to sin. I said it earlier, but Paul talks about it. Slaves to sin. We don't learn from that, we're doomed to repeat it. And we're watching it happen to Israel here in Hosea. Anything else? If not, we're going to bump on to chapter 9. So, chapter 9, to put it simply, just continues this role that God is on through his prophet of judgment. We're not done yet. So, can I get somebody to read verses 1 through 3 of Hosea 9?
Do not rejoice, O Israel, with exultation like the nations, for you have played the harlot, forsaking your God. You have loved harlot's earnings on every threshing floor. Threshing floor and winepress will not feed them, and new wine will fill them. They will not remain in the Lord's land, but Ephraim will return to Egypt, and in Assyria they will eat unclean food. They will not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord.
Oh, you're good. So 1 through 3, all right? What is God's point here in 9, 1 through 3? Rejoice no more. This isn't going to be a good thing. Because you have acted promiscuously. All, translations render it differently. But You've been infidelious. You've been unfaithful. And it's going to fail you. And Assyria is going to take you away. See, that's the interesting thing here, right? It's been like they want to go back to Egypt. They want to go back to Egypt. God says you're not going to even get that. You're going to get Assyria. And that's worse. But there's this, they outline this infidelity. It's going to fail them. And in Assyria, they're going to eat unclean food. Now, why does the prophet take the time to say that? Seems kind of odd, right? In this discussion of judgment, why does the prophet take time to say, oh yeah, and the food you're going to eat is unclean? Any guesses on why he might say that?
You think it should be due to the fact that knowing that God views sin as an abomination, they view unclean things as an abomination, so that could be somewhat of a metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of discussion like that, right? Especially when you get to things like the New Testament with the Pharisees, right? They really harp on this kind of stuff. They don't like unclean food. Yeah, that's one way to read this. I think that could be part of the context here. I want you to think there's a moment in a different book, not one of our minor prophets, where this kind of idea comes up, though. Starts with a D.
We'll go with Daniel.
It is Daniel, right? You have, this is, later on than where Hosea is at, but you have Daniel, coming into Nebuchadnezzar's court, and he won't eat the food, right? Because it's not, clean. But why do they touch on this so hard? Why is this such a stickler, such a point for them? Well, it's a marker of their being different and a holy people. It's the point of the unclean food laws was not that like these animals or these awful things you don't eat. No, it's what the other nations around you eat. It's what they're using to worship these other gods. It's so you are different. So you can show an identity that is different than the nations. So you can show an identity that shows you have identified yourself with the one God. And now you will be taken into Assyria to eat unclean food. Your identity will be changed. You are no longer with the one God of Israel. You are no longer identified with Yahweh. And you will eat unclean food in Assyria. This isn't, today I'm going to eat a taco instead of a burger. This is today I am no longer who I thought I once was. Their fundamental identity as the Jewish people of God is going to change. Anything on verses 1 through 3 before we bump on to the next little section here? If not, can I get somebody to read verses 4 through 6?
They will not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord, nor will their sacrifices please him. Their bread will be to them like mourners' bread. All who eat it will be defiled, because their bread will be for themselves alone. It will not enter the house of the Lord. What will you do on the day of the appointed festival, and on the day of the feast of the Lord? For behold, they will be gone because of destruction. Egypt will gather them together. Memphis will bury them. Leaves will take possession of their treasures of silver. Ones will be in their tents.
Verses 4 through 6 continue just to show like this ineffectual sacrifices, these ineffectual feasts that aren't going to help them, that aren't going to save them, and even running from all of this judgment's not going to save them either. There is no escaping this. God has declared your time is up. You're not getting out of this. Judgment isn't coming. It's come. Anything on these verses? If not, can I get somebody to read 7 through 9? So, verses 7 through 9 finish out this first oracle of judgment of chapter 9. And there's some interesting thoughts that are brought up here. So, he's in finishing this oracle, this first one of chapter 9, God makes a few things clear. First, it's that first line. The days of punishment have come, the days of retribution have come. This starts in the minor prophet, this idea of the day. I have Joel outlined up there because that's our next book. And we'll start to see this consistent idea, the day, the day, the day of the Lord. This starts that ball rolling, at least in my head. The day of the Lord has come. Which side shall you stand? And Joel's going, when we get there, I know it's 3 short chapters, but it focuses on this idea. The second thing I see here is they're so far gone, they view the prophet of God as like an insane, raving man. Right? Like they don't even like think he's sane anymore, much less would they listen to him. Question, when's the last time any of y'all listened to somebody that was insane and go, oh yeah, that makes sense? Yeah, you're all chuckling. But, I mean, that's how Israel feels about the prophet of God. Why would we listen to him? He's crazy. But he's the only one actually making sense. And there's an interesting term brought up here, verse 8, Ephraim's watchman is with my God. It's a common, or not so common, but it pops up a few times. Like Jeremiah 6:17, it's used in regards to the prophets a lot. They're called like watchmen from God. Ezekiel does it a couple times as well. I can think of off the top of my head. But it's just a common term used. So when he says, the watchman, it's typically referring to the prophet. And the big point there is, well, they're hostile to God in his own house, right? Like, it's not like they're doing this somewhere where they think God can't see. They're doing it right where God is, or should be, his own house. And I think this is the point. Verse 9, they have deeply corrupted themselves. Nobody made them do this. They made this decision. They corrupted themselves. They made an active decision of their own free will and corrupted themselves. And he will remember their iniquity and he will punish their sins. They made a choice. Anything else on this before we?
A couple of cities named in this chapter, which probably is worthwhile to review why they would be there. And one says, as in the days of Gibeah. Gibeah was in Benjamin. It was a city that the young priest went to with his concubine. And the men of the city wanted to have relationships with the man. And they ended up sending out the concubine, and they abused her until she died. And then a great war broke out between Benjamin and the rest of the nation of Israel. I think we can't think of anything much worse than that situation. And how do you get worse than that?
Give me like 20 minutes and we're going to talk about it explicitly.
Okay.
Yeah, we're actually getting to Judges 19 and 20 because it's brought up again. And you're right. It's intentional. Gibeah, keep that in the back of all of your minds. It is awful and it's intentional that it's brought up because it's bad. It's everything wrong. And good catch. That is exactly what's going on. But anything else on verses 7 through 9?
Kind of what we just read is back to like having a partner, being a Christian, so to speak, in today's world. So a lot of times I think to myself, if somebody sat me in a room with a non-Christian and had a conversation with me, one, did they
Hmm.
I've done it,
Yeah.
It stood out.
Yeah, no, we need to be, unlike Israel, willing to listen to those who are trying to help us. See, I at times in my own head, without even realizing I've done it, think of like these prophets sometimes as like these great figures who aren't really that, different or like extremely different from the people they're preaching to, and this, that, or the other. When in all reality for them, these prophets are no different than them. They're people just like they are. And they're ignoring them. Just because somebody's just like me doesn't mean I need to ignore them. Just because somebody's not that great in my eyes doesn't mean I need to disregard what they say when it comes to my, life, my spiritual well-being with God. Because, we've all sinned. We're all in the same boat. We're just trying to get to the same destination. And that's, eternity with God. Jeff.
I guess this is kind of obvious, but the big picture here is who's the boss? I mean, if you're at work and your boss shows you how to do something and you do it the exact opposite, and then he comes back and tells you no like this, and you're like, no, because I don't have to listen to you. I'll do it the way I want to. How long are you gonna have that job?
Not long.
And so these people have been told and told and told, and then blow up on it, and they're just.
Yeah, no, you're right. They've had repeated chances. Actually, we're about to go over that. Anything else on these verses?
Quickly, I guess I will remember their iniquity and will punish their sins. That language specifically and exactly is contrasted in what we get in Jesus. Jeremiah 31:34. For I will forgive their iniquity and their sin, I will remember no more. There's a lot we can go in there, obviously, but contrast there.
Yeah, no, it's intentional language throughout a lot of this. Like, part of the reason I wanted to study minor prophets, you see a lot of it pop up in other places, the same language, the same ideas, the same thoughts. I mean, here in the next chapter or so, we're going to get an explicit, reference to Christ because, Matthew quotes it in reference to Christ. I mean, it pops up all over the place. And I don't want to ignore these books. I want to go through them because of that. Anything else on these handful of verses this morning? If not, verses 10 and 11 start another judgment image. Can somebody read those two verses for me?
Found Israelite grapes in the wilderness, saw your fathers as the first ripened fig tree at its first season. And they came to Battle Peor and consecrated themselves into a shameful thing and became abominable like that which they loved. As for Ephraim, the glory shall fly away like a bird. There shall be no birth, and none with child, and no conception.
So we see this judgment image. And the first thing mentioned is like God finding Israel like grapes in the wilderness, and this like agricultural imagery, right? It's a big thing in the Bible. It happens all the time. It's the ancient world. That's what they understand, right? That's their culture. But I think this is a lot like how God finds Israel in Egypt, right? I mean, they're like grapes in the wilderness. There's nothing around them. There's no help. There's no support. And even that fig tree image that's used just a little, a line later, I mean, that's what Christ uses to refer to Israel in the New Testament, right? It's this agricultural image. But there's an interesting location brought up. Baal Peor. My question is, what is Baal Peor?
That was very near Moab and in Moab. And they, it was after Balaam was supposed to curse Israel and bless them. And the king of Moab was very upset. And evidently Balaam informed the king and the rulers, if you get these people involved with you in your worship, then God will destroy them. And
Numbers 25.
That's a god of the Moabites, isn't that the name of the god that they call
Mm-hmm.
their god?
Yeah. Baal. Numbers 25, verses 1 through 9, if y'all want to take a look. I'll read this. While Israel was staying in the Hosea grove, the people began to prostitute themselves with the women of Moab. The women invited them to the sacrifices for their gods, and the people ate and bowed in worship to their gods. So Israel aligned itself with Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses told Israel's judges, "Kill each of the men who align themselves with Baal of Peor." This is specific. Hosea brings this up for a reason. One, it's one of the first places we truly see Israel like really intermingle with some of these other cultures around them. It's a problem because obviously they start intermingling like that. These people get in their heads, they teach them things. And what's the first thing that happens? Idolatry, cult prostitution, maybe like every sin that happens in Hosea. It's the same thing over again. The sins of Numbers 25 are the same exact sins that Hosea is talking about on the national level of Israel. And the judgment's going to be carried out the same way. The cycle has repeated. I brought this up way back at the beginning of our study over a month ago. This cycle, right? And we see that it's happening again, right? Sin's happened, and Hosea's entire point is the consequence is coming. Or is the other half of this going to happen is the question. They're no better than they were out there in the wilderness. The cycle's repeating itself. They've committed sin, the exact same sins, with the exact same gods involved. Are they going to make a difference? Are they actually going to change? Anything on this?
Again, it's kind of a sidelight point. There's a phrase that's used or a description of Phineas, who's the one that stops the plague and all of that kind of stuff as far as, what's going on. And if you read about him, he's called zealous or jealous or whatever. But the statement that interests me is found in Psalm 106. So Psalm 106 is one of these long litanies of how bad Israel got, trying to remind them of the mess that they were in, because it seems to be post-captivity as far as 106 is. But in recounting this, verse 28, they yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, they ate sacrifices offered to the dead. Now notice verse 30, then Phineas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stayed, and that was counted to him for righteousness. That's the only other time I know that phrase is used. In Genesis 15, Abraham's faith is counted to him as righteousness. And here, Phineas's zeal is counted to him as righteousness. I don't know of any other places in the Old Testament that anybody's ever referred to like that. We have Abraham whose faith was counted as righteousness. Here we have somebody who's exercising faith, right? He's zealous. It's because of his faith. So we see faith in action in Phineas, and that's counted as righteous. It's just a very interesting idea that crops up. And like I said, I don't know of anybody else that's ever referred to that.
I can't think of anybody else off the top of my head, but I like the point you brought up there, right? It's for Phineas and the rest of that Numbers passage, he acts on it, right? He sees this problem in Numbers 25, and he comes forward to stop the problem. And what are the people of Hosea's day lacking? Somebody stopping the problem. Hosea seems to be the only one coming forward to say something. Hosea even himself is willing to, it seems, take extreme measures. That's chapters 1 through 3. He marries Gomer to demonstrate to them, hey, look at the problem you have. Is somebody going to stop the problem? Anything else on the Numbers 25 to Hosea 9? Yeah.
Jude, verse 11, written to Christians, written to us. This is what he says. Woe to them, for they have gone the way of Cain, and for pay they have rushed headlong into the era of Balaam, and perished in the rebellion of Korah. He's saying these people who are supposed to be followers of Christ have become like this. And he references they have gone the way of Balaam. They have let the world and its influence, covetousness, whatever, money, turn them so that they are like the people who were at the hill.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reference to us. We think sometimes the Old Testament is not applicable to us because we're under the New Covenant. And we are under the New Covenant, but the Old Testament is extremely applicable to us. And we can become just like the people that God condemned in the Old Testament. We condemn them then, will condemn us now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Good point. We aren't out. A majority of your Bible is Old Testament. This is the most simple way to put it. There are more books in your Bible that are in your Old Testament than the New. We can't treat the Old Testament like it doesn't matter to us, like it's not applicable. Actually, it's extremely applicable. We just saw, through Patrick's comment and Becca Garrett's comment, there's a through line here. Even with this odd passage in Numbers, here in Hosea 9, it's brought up in a consistent way. The problem's the same. All the way back at Numbers 25, all the way through to Jude. People have turned this way, away from God. It affects first century Christians. It affects us today. The same sins affect us. The difference for us between the Old Testament and New Testament is one thing. Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross. We're not that much different. We just have a Savior who's willing to make the difference. Anything else on this morning? Hmm. Mm-hmm. 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 It's their history. God reminds them of it constantly. Look at what you did then. It didn't work out then. What makes you think it's any different now?
Just kind of like what you got up on the board, we just constantly keep returning back to sin even today, right? We even have in the New Testament where, the dog turns back to the vomit. And the other day, my dog did that. I told her, so this she spit it up. I said, don't you mess with that. She knows I'm her master, right? She'll listen to me for a little bit. And I'm talking about a dog that will follow me anywhere in the woods, through any creek bed. She will get out of sight, and I can call her name for 10 minutes. She'll get too far away, but she always comes back. But I will walk away from that little pile of vomit, and she'll run. I don't care. I do it every time. Knowing there's a consequence, that I'm going to be upset. Just like that.
Yeah. Mr. Lanfear?
I'm gonna say there's a whole nother
Hmm. That was one thing, especially as I prepared for, well, walking through Hosea 9 and 10 and 8. And one thing that stands out to me, and I think you just touched on, God is so beyond patient with Israel and Judah. I mean, think about it. He takes them from Exodus all the way through Christ and all these things. I mean, and he doesn't just outright get rid of them. I can't, like, my brain sometimes struggles to comprehend that patience. Right? I mean, it's not till 70 AD that the temple is just outright destroyed and the Jewish people kind of really lose their identity. And it starts all the way back in Exodus. God is beyond patient with them. That is the grace of God overflowing to these people. I mean, I can't even imagine being God's into this.
It's also the time for God to fulfill his promises that he made. It's part of the nation, right? He's going to uphold what he promised in his time. But that's part of that grace and everything, even though they've turned away, right? They failed their part of that covenant, that promise. He's still going to uphold his.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Even in that patience, you're right. He upholds his end of this deal when he's beyond patient with them. When they haven't upheld, well, what it seems like any tenet of that covenant, he still upholds his end and puts himself on the cross. Anything else? All right. I guess we'll verse 11 there, kind of tying back into that last point. It's because of the same perpetuation of sin, that same cycle repeating and repeating and repeating with him, that verse 11 makes it pretty clear they're going to lose all their glory, all this power, all these things that they've seemingly overflowed with, seemingly have sought out so much, you know, these idols and the money and all these things. They're going to lose it all. And they're not going to be a people anymore. And that brings us kind of, can I get somebody to read 12 through 14 real quick?
Though they bring up the children, yet I will bereave them to the last man. Yes, woe to them when I depart from them. Just as I saw Ephraim like Tyre, planted in a pleasant place, so Ephraim will bring out his children to the murder. Give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying woman and a dry breast.
11 through 14, simply put, show the devastation in terms that it's brutal. Because God's not saying, I'm just getting rid of you. He's like, no, your future generations will be no more.
Refers to Ephraim, they will have no children, they will have no descendants. Ephraim was often used synonymously with northern Israel, or referred to northern Israel as Ephraim. Ephraim got the double blessing from Jacob,
Mm-hmm.
and was very prominent throughout the history of Israel. What God is saying here is Israel is no more. From this point on, you may have a few references to Israel and Ephraim in some of the other prophets. Generally, they're referring more, I think, to Judah when they say Israel at that point, from that point on. But you never hear anything referred to as Ephraim again. And it starts being called Samaria. So this blessing that Ephraim had, there was actually should put them over everybody in Israel because they
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly on it. Right? It's because, I mean, get to the New Testament. Come on. There's people from these tribes, this northern kingdom, still around, but they're not the same. Right? The descendants will never be like their forefathers again. They're going to be cut off from God in a way that their forefathers couldn't even imagine. Right? Because they will no longer be right there like they were. And it's devastating. And I think it's particularly devastating for one reason. In the ancient world, what is the one thing that you pass forward? Inheritance. Like, if you read ancient texts where they're talking about their inheritance and how much it matters to them and how much they focus on it, losing it is, cataclysmic to them. Wait, you mean I don't get the land of my fathers? Well, everybody I've ever known has been buried there. Actually, in a lot of cultures around the time, being buried on your family ancestral inheritance property was actually your way to access the afterlife in their minds. And then, well, economically, that's how you survived. That's why everybody in the ancient world grows and has vineyards and all these agricultural things, because that's how they made money to live. See, everything is tied so closely to that inheritance. Hence why God makes such a point in the old law, like about inheritance law and how that should work. And here, they're not going to get that inheritance. They're losing it. All of it. This is a judgment that's, devastating. Socially, economically, spiritually, the consequence hurts. Jeff.
The great promises made to Abraham for land, nation, and seed. And nation, when you think about what is a nationality, I've lectured what makes people in the United States a nation. We're hugely diverse, but we're a nation. And if you took the people in this country and just scattered them all over the world, they would become whatever they landed in. Like, what if you brought up your kids in Canada or Mexico? Would it still be this?
Yeah.
Your identity?
Yeah, it is your identity. I think it ties back to there at the beginning of the chapter, right? You will eat unclean food in Assyria. They're losing every single lick and piece and part of their identities through this judgment. Down to the inheritance.
But they already weren't anything like the children of God. They had done that to themselves.
Yeah, they did this to themselves. There's also one other interesting thing. Give them a womb that carries and breasts that are dry. That's intentional. It is a exact reversal of the Genesis 49:25 blessing from Jacob. Jacob says the exact opposite of that. Every blessing that's been ever poured out upon them is being pulled back. Israel's being devastated down to the core. Anything on that handful of verses before we move on? Dad? Oh, was that okay. He's telling me I got 5 minutes. All right, verses 15 through 17. Can somebody read those for me?
All their evil is at Gilgal. Indeed, I came to hate them there, because of the wickedness of their deeds. I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebels. Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up. They will bear no fruit. Even though they bear children, I will slay the precious ones of their womb. My God will cast them away, because they have not listened to him. They will be wanderers among the nations.
this handful of verses just finish out the chapter, showing the complete rejection of the people by God because of their rebellion against him, their wickedness, and, their lack of listening to him. I mean, he makes it pretty clear why. You didn't listen. You didn't know me.
Reference to Gilgal. In 2 Samuel 12, they go to Gilgal to remove the kingdom when they first made Saul king. And Samuel tells them how this is not God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
And he calls down a severe punishment from God on the people. At that point, they say, like, okay, we don't want a king, but it's too late. We got a king. So this is, they had, at this point, in 1 Samuel 12, actually before, starting in 1 Samuel 8, they had rejected God as their king.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All their evil appears at Gilgal, where they first rejected God as king. Yeah, it's poetic. The minor prophets, if anything, are poetic. They're historical and poetic. Now, what does God make their ultimate consequence here at the end of the chapter? Wandering. Wandering among the nations. Minor prophets are pretty poetic. Where did God find them? Among the nations. And to where shall they return? Among the nations. As wanderers.
I've been looking at this, back in verse 12. I realize, I want to emphasize God's severity and wrath totally, understanding his mercy and his love and his promise. But we need to not just hold on to that as our ticket to the heaven.
Mm-hmm.
God expects us to live righteously before him. He didn't say, I gave Christ, as Paul says in Romans, to continue in sin, that grace may abound.
Absolutely
God
not.
forbid. In verse 12 it says, the last line says, yes, woe to them indeed when I depart from them. In Matthew 23, we read all the woes that Christ gave to the Pharisees, and 40 years later, he totally destroyed their city. So when God leaves you, you're in dire straits. You don't want God out of your life.
Mm-hmm.
It is a woe. I don't think we can put enough emphasis on what is the woe.
Mm-hmm. Well, to finish out chapter 9 in the last 2 seconds I have, it's exile and diaspora. That's the ultimate consequence of all this. They are exiled and they are dispersed among the nations. Israel no more.